Enos was born at a time marked by spiritual changes and challenges. He was the son of Seth, grandson of Adam and Eve, and grew up hearing stories about the Garden of Eden, a lost paradise that he never saw, but which still loomed over his family like a distant shadow. His grandfather, the first man formed by the hands of God, was already old when Enos arrived in the world. The wrinkles on Adam's face seemed to contain secrets that no one else could tell, and perhaps that was why the old patriarch's eyes were lost on the horizon, as if trying to see something beyond what others saw. Ever since he was a boy, Enos realized that his family carried a weight. It wasn't just the weight of survival, of hard work on the land, but something deeper, an inexplicable longing for a time when God walked side by side with men. There were nights when Enos would sit by the fire, listening to his father tell of the days before the fall, when the world was still pure. He spoke of Eden with a tone mixed with wonder and sadness, and every word fell on Enos like raindrops on dry ground. Check out more Bible stories full of emotion by subscribing to the channel now and activating the bell to receive all notifications. If you like the content, feel free to support our work with a donation by clicking on the Thanks a Lot button. You can also become a member of the channel and enjoy exclusive benefits. But time didn't wait. The days went by and humanity grew. The lands were filled with people who didn't know the Creator as well as their ancestors. Enos noticed that, as the years went by, many turned away from God, as if he were just an ancient memory, a name whispered in the wind. There was something in the air, a restlessness that he couldn't explain, but which grew stronger and stronger in his chest. It was this restlessness that one day led him to leave the tribe and walk alone through the countryside, trying to understand what was burning inside him. Night was approaching. The sky was painted in shades of gold and lilac, and Enos sensed that something was about to happen. The wind blew softly through the tall grass, rustling the leaves as if whispering ancient secrets. Enos walked unhurriedly, his feet touching the earth lightly, as if he feared disturbing the silence of creation. The sky above him darkened slowly, painted in shades of violet and deep blue. The first bright points appeared, blinking in the firmament as if they were there just to observe him. But inside Enos, what was moving wasn't silence, it was a call. Ever since he was a child, he had learned that God existed, that he was powerful, and that one day he had walked among men. But why did he now seem so far away? Why had men stopped calling him? This question kept running through his mind. He had seen his own generation drift away, too busy with the chores of the day, the harvest, the hunt, the burdens of life. God was a name spoken but not sought, and this unsettled Enos in a way he couldn't explain. He knelt on the ground, feeling the cold earth beneath his knees. For a moment he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Then he opened his mouth and spoke. At first his voice came out low, an almost hesitant whisper, but as the words flowed, something inside him broke loose. It was a cry, a longing that he didn't even know he held in his chest. He called out for God, not as if he were talking about him, but as if he were talking to him. He called out like a son who misses his father, like someone who longs for an answer. And there, in the middle of the night, in the lonely field where only the wind and the stars bore witness, Enos continued to cry out, until something changed. He couldn't tell if it was the air, if it was a weight shifting inside him, or if it was the simple certainty that God was listening. But something was different, and that feeling made him not want to stop. Enos's voice became steadier and steadier, each word charged with a deep desire, as if his own heart was speaking for him. At first it seemed that only the wind was responding, carrying his cry beyond the hills. But something changed. The silence of the night no longer seemed empty. There was a presence there, invisible but as real as the ground beneath his knees. Enos's chest rose and fell rapidly, not out of tiredness but out of a mixture of awe and reverence. His whole body seemed to awaken to something he had never felt before. He closed his eyes tighter and held his breath for a moment. A soft warmth ran through his skin, as if an invisible fire was being lit inside him. It wasn't a fire that burned, but one that illuminated. And in that instant, he knew God was there. Not with thunder or voices tearing through the heavens, not with great signs or storms sweeping across the land, but with a peace that enveloped everything. Enos felt tears streaming down his face without him even realizing it. He sobbed, not out of sadness, but out of a relief so profound that it seemed he had been waiting for it all his life. God was not far away. God had never been far away. And then came the answer. Not in audible words, but in something that touched his soul in a way he could never explain. He felt a weight being lifted, a lightness that made his heart want to fly. His sins, his mistakes, his doubts, everything seemed to dissolve in that presence. He didn't need anything else. There, in that moment, Enos knew that he had been heard, that he had been accepted. His body was still shaking when he opened his eyes, panting. The stars shone brighter, the wind seemed to sing. And deep down in his soul, he knew this was only the beginning, because now, more than ever, he understood that his prayer couldn't stop. Enos stood up slowly, as if he was still trying to understand everything that had just happened. His knees were dirty with dirt, his face still wet with tears, but inside him there was a certainty that hadn't existed before. God had answered, not with words that could be heard, but with a presence so real that it seemed to have been imprinted on his very heart. He took a deep breath, looking around. The world was still the same. The countryside stretched out in front of him, the trees swayed in the wind, and the stars twinkled in the sky. But for Enos, everything seemed different. He no longer saw the place as just a piece of land, but as a living testimony to God's greatness. Every leaf that fluttered around him, every breeze that touched his skin, seemed to echo the voice of the Creator. A thought crossed his mind. If God answered him, if God heard him, then why weren't the others crying out too? Why had his people strayed so far away? It was as if they were asleep, as if they had forgotten something that had once been essential. Something inside Enos burned. He couldn't keep it to himself. What had happened that night couldn't end there, in the silence of a lonely field. He needed to do more. He needed to teach. He needed to call others to this quest. But how? How could he get them to look to God again? With this thought, Enos began to walk back to his village, feeling the weight of this new mission growing inside him. Every step he took seemed charged with a new purpose, as if a path was being laid out before him. He didn't know exactly what awaited him, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't be silent. Dawn tinged the sky golden as Enos crossed the village boundary. The first lights of the day illuminated the simple huts, the fires that still gave off wisps of smoke in the cold morning air. Men went out to work, children ran through the fields, women carried baskets of food. Life went on at its own pace, but Enos saw everything differently. He looked around, searching for the familiar faces of his family, his neighbors, those he had grown up with. They were going about their lives as usual, but he saw something now that he hadn't noticed before: absence. Not of people, but of something greater, of a calling. God was there, as close as he had been to him the night before, but no one seemed to notice. His heart squeezed. How could he change that? How could he make them see what he now saw so clearly? Enos wasn't a leader. He wasn't a strong or influential man. He was just someone who had prayed, someone who had been heard. But maybe, just maybe, that was enough. He closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. The answer had been there all along. If God had heard him when he cried out, then this was the way. It wasn't about pretty words, speeches, or strength. It was about prayer. So without hesitation, he fell to his knees in the middle of the village and began to cry out. His voice cut through the morning silence, strong and sincere, carried by the same fire that burned inside him. Some stopped to stare, others frowned, confused, but Enos didn't care. He prayed, he interceded, he called God's name as if his life depended on it, and little by little something began to happen. People who had only looked on from afar now came closer, curious, hesitant. Some lowered their heads, others murmured something softly, almost like a timid echo of Enos's prayer. And then, in the middle of that small village, where the name of God had become just a distant memory, something began to awaken. At first, it was just him. Kneeling on the dirt floor, his hands raised, his voice breaking the silence of the morning. Enos cried out as if he were alone in the world, as if every word that came out of his mouth was torn straight from his heart. But he was no longer alone. People began to approach him, first with curiosity, then with something akin to silent disquiet. There was something about that prayer, something different, something that made a knot form in the chest of those who heard it. One by one, the previously indifferent eyes began to fill with a strange glow, as if a forgotten memory was resurfacing. Enos didn't stand up or stop. He felt the weight of that moment. He felt that something was being awakened, that the veil covering the hearts of his people was beginning to unravel. God's name, which for so long had been treated as a distant whisper, was now proclaimed in the midst of the people, strong, alive, and burning. Then came the first sob. A woman in the background fell to her knees. Her hands covered her face, and a deep cry shook her body. Then a man, then another. One by one, as if an invisible wave were passing over them, more and more people began to fall to their knees, to raise their voices, to call on the name of the Lord. But where the light shines, the shadows also move. Not everyone was happy with what they saw. In the midst of the scene, some looked on suspiciously, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. Whispers began to emerge among those who didn't understand what was happening. And Enos knew. Awakening always brings opposition. But he also knew that he couldn't stop. The murmurs grew like the wind before the storm. Some watched the scene with narrowed, suspicious eyes. Enos felt the gazes on him, heavy with doubt and resistance. There were always those who didn't understand, those who feared what they couldn't control. A tall man with a rigid countenance stepped forward. His name was Jared, one of the village elders, known for his firm voice and practical way of seeing the world. He crossed his arms, looking at the people on their knees, some crying, others clamoring, and his brow furrowed. "What's going on here?" His voice cut through the air like a blade. The people fell silent for a moment. Some lowered their heads, as if they had been caught up in something wrong. Others were still trembling, fighting the emotion that had seized their bodies. But Enos didn't look away. He felt the weight of the question, but there was no fear inside him. He stood up slowly, his knees still marked by the earth, his heart pounding, but his voice was firm. "We are crying out to the Lord," he said, his voice echoing through the sudden silence. "The God of our fathers, the God who has never left us, but whom we have forgotten." Jared stared at him for a moment, the muscles in his jaw tightening. He opened his mouth to reply, but then something happened. A fallen woman began to speak, her voice muddied by tears. "I felt him," she whispered, looking down at her hands as if she were holding something invisible. "God is here." And then another man next to her agreed, his voice hoarse. "Me too." One by one, those who had been touched began to speak, their voices adding up like a spreading flame. But while some were being awakened, others still refused to believe. Conflict grew, division began to form, and Enos knew that this was only the beginning. The air was charged with something no one could explain. On one side, those who had been touched, their eyes shining as if they saw something beyond what was visible. On the other, the skeptics, those crossing their arms, doubtful, suspicious, some even angry. Jared was still there, watching, frowning, as if trying to understand what was going on. "It's just a passing emotion," he said, shaking his head. "I've seen it before. Tomorrow, everyone will be back to their lives, and nothing will have changed." But a voice interrupted him. No, it was a young man, a boy who until then had always been quiet, one of many in the village. But now his voice sounded strong, as if he had just discovered something he had never known before. "I've spent my whole life hearing about God," he continued, his eyes fixed on Jared. "But I never felt him. I never knew what it was like to really call on his name. Today I know." The silence that followed was heavy. Jared looked away, and something flashed across his face. For a brief moment, it wasn't anger or contempt, but something close to doubt. Enos noticed. He saw that even the most resistant felt something different, something they couldn't deny. But the heart of man can be as hard as stone when it resists what it doesn't understand. The days that followed were marked by changes. Some began to gather to pray to the Lord, to call him by name as Enos had done. Others, however, began to drift away, suspicious and annoyed. The people were divided, as if two paths were beginning to form before them. The nights began to be different in the village. Where before there had only been the rustling of trees and the sound of crackling fires, now voices were heard. At first they were few, timid, almost like hesitant echoes. But over time, they grew. Men and women began to gather in groups, sit around the fire and call on the name of the Lord. Prayers previously forgotten filled the air again. It was something new, something they had never done with such intensity. Those who had felt God's presence could no longer live as before. It was as if a veil had been lifted from their eyes. When they spoke, their faces had a different glow, a certainty that hadn't existed before. But not everyone saw this as a good thing. The village elders began to get annoyed. They looked at those meetings with tight-lipped expressions, their eyes full of doubt. It was dangerous to change what had always been the same. And deep down, there was a fear. Because if Enos was right, if those who followed him were right, then it meant that something was wrong with the way they had been living up until then. Jared, who had been silent for the last few days, finally spoke. "Call on the name of the Lord?" He stared at Enos, his voice laden with irony, as if that would solve anything, as if words could change the fate of men. But before Enos could answer, another man stood up. An old man, his face marked by time, but his eyes steely. "Words can't change the fate of men," he said, "but God can." Jared didn't reply. His face became rigid, his fists clenched. Something inside him was fighting against what was happening, and Enos knew in that instant that the battle wasn't over yet. Time passed, and the village was never the same again. Those who had experienced the awakening continued to cry out, seeking the Lord day after day. God's name, once forgotten, was now heard at dawn, at dusk, under the starry sky of silent nights. It was as if a new flame had been lit, and nothing else could extinguish it. But the conflict remained. Some refused to accept this change, looked suspiciously at those who prayed, as if they feared what they could not understand. Jared became the loudest voice of opposition. For him it was all foolishness, a waste of time. Man's destiny was to fight for the land, for food, for survival. Invoking an invisible God, that wouldn't solve anything. Enos, however, never argued. He didn't need to prove anything with words. He just prayed, and he kept praying. He knew that men's hearts were hard earth, but the rain of God's presence could soften them over time. Some he knew would never bend, but others were already different. Over the years, Enos's faith became a living testimony. He wasn't a warrior or a great leader. He didn't raise swords or rule over men. But it was through him that the name of the Lord was once again invoked. His life became a landmark, a reminder that God was never far away. He just waited to be called. And so, when his days came to an end, Enos left as he had lived, in communion with God. His name was engraved in history, not by the deeds of his hands, but by the cry of his heart, and his voice, even after being silenced by death, never ceased to echo. For whenever a man, a woman, or a child bends down to call on the name of the Lord, Enos is there in spirit, among those who have never stopped seeking the presence of the one who created everything. Enos's days came to an end, but his legacy remained. He left no monuments, no riches, no earthly conquests to be remembered. What he left was something much greater, a call, an echo that has never faded, because it was in the days of Enos that men began to call on the name of the Lord, and that cry has never ceased. His story teaches us something profound. Enos was not the strongest, the wisest, or the most influential. He had no power over kings. He wielded no weapons. He possessed nothing but a heart that longed for God. But sometimes that's exactly what changes everything. Sometimes all it takes is a single voice crying out in the midst of silence to awaken those who are asleep. Enos's life shows us that no matter how far away the Creator seems to be, he never abandons us. He is there, waiting. But we have to call out to him. You have to seek him, insist on him, not remain silent. Enos did this, and because of his faith, many others learned to do the same. We also learn that there will always be resistance. Not everyone accepted Enos's call. Many doubted, resisted, even mocked, but he didn't give up, because truth doesn't need to be imposed. It needs to be lived, and Enos lived his truth to the end. And now, so long after, the question still echoes. Who, these days, still calls on the name of the Lord? Who has the courage to cry out when everyone around them is silent? The answer lies in each one of us. For as long as there is someone willing to bend the knee and call out to God, Enos's legacy will never die. If you liked Enos's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.